Welcome to a tutorial video on using React. In this video, I'm going to talk about handling events. So before I get into talking about events, let's rewind a little bit. In the previous video, when I talked about states, we reviewed that states are incredibly important within React. They allow React components to retain information and then to react to that information, if you pardon the pun. So, states are incredibly important. We're keeping information, we're doing something with that information. This comes into play when we think about handling events, because if we're handling events, we're probably dealing with states. We're probably also calling the setState function. And we remember in the previous video that whenever we call that function, it not only changes the state somehow, it also refreshes that component. That is, it reruns the render function. So we're keeping track of information, and then within render, we're probably making a conditional choice, or we're doing something with that information that we're retaining, and it's going to change how the information we're being shown to the user is changed. So as we get closer to talking about handling events, the user is going to do something, the state's going to change, the render function is going to be called, and somehow some information is going to be changed. Usually the user interface is going to be updated in some way. The user does something, the interface is updated, some information is changed. This comes back to that important idea of states within React, and as I'm about to get into, how handling events works into all of that, and all of these concepts come together. So within this series of videos, I've talked about how we broke up all of our files into our different objects. Our files represent our objects. And this allows us to a greater degree of efficiency when working with different ideas and changing code. We don't want to change code in multiple places. We want to change code in one place and allow all of our objects to all work towards each other and towards our larger goal. So let's quickly review all of that. Render function, incredibly important within React. All components have a render function. They're always rendering something. So we're starting right here, the very root. React DOM.render, it is rendering shopping list. Let's quickly move over to shopping list, and we see it now has its own state information. In the previous video, when we were talking about its state information, we put it in item. An item was dealing with state stuff. When we were clicking on things, it was remembering we had clicked, and it was either showing one thing or showing another thing. React has this idea of lifting state. That is, as a component sort of starts to build in complexity, it might be a good idea to lift that state complexity out of a single component and put it within its parent or another component. That is, if one component is within another, and in our case, items were within our shopping list, it might make more sense, not always, but it might make more sense to lift that complexity out and put it within the parent component, have the parent component do things, and then have the child, the other component, do less things. So same way as we broke up our single file into multiple files when we're working with modules, we can start to think about state information and how we're handling events as lifting state into a parent and breaking up how we handle states due to their complexity, and breaking up these ideas to allow us a greater efficiency. Again, coming back to the idea of using React, thinking through the way React handles things. We can break up our files into different objects, or break up our objects into different files, that is. Then we know those objects relate to each other, so we import and export them. Then our components have state information, and finally, when we're reacting to that state information, we can put states into different parts that then interact with each other in different ways. So it's not a great deal of complexity in a single file, but little bits of complexity here and there, breaking that all up into a smoother and more efficient layout. So let's get back to this code finally, now that I've explained that. So as I reviewed in the previous video, we were talking about states. We need to save props. It's incredibly important. Those are the properties that are passed to this. So because we're dealing with state, then the first thing we need to do is use a constructor function, because we need to think about through the initial values that are set when an object is created. So a constructor function is incredibly important. We're passing props, calling super props, that is passing information to the parent class, React component, So all of them has the same information. Then, as I talked about in the previous video, setting an initial value for this.state. In this case, we're setting items to an empty array. Then we're going to do something with that array momentarily. The next thing that's happening looks a little bit weird. Notice I've less comments here. It says, since add item will be called within another scope, and this is part of that lifting state I'm going to talk about as we get deeper into this video, we bind it to the this inside shopping list. One of the things in dealing with JavaScript is trying to figure out which this, is it that this, or this, that, everything else. One of the ways we can start to work with that and think through it is using the bind function. It's part of JavaScript. We can bind the this to a certain scope. What we're doing then is we're saying, okay, this.add item is equal to this.add item that bind this. So it means when the add item function is called somewhere else, it will refer, this will refer to the this within shopping list. This is important because it's part of that lifting state, and it's going to make a little more sense when we move to another thing. But I'm already sort of foreshadowing some information here. We will be calling add item somewhere else, but we don't want it to deal with the this of that scope. We want the this scope of add item to be shopping list, and the bind function allows us to do that. And that's why I've added that extra comment there. So we always remember we're binding the this to shopping list. When we use add item, it's this will refer to shopping list. So in fact, let's look at add item right here. So coming down here, we say add item. The const item is equal to this state items, and then we're concatenating new item. This is where states get a little bit tricky. So what we're doing then is we're saying, okay, whatever the this state items is, we're adding a new one, new item, and we're saving it as a constant value. Within any time this is being called, we're saving the items. The reason we're doing this is to work with set state. I mentioned in the previous video, anytime we change the state, we want to call set state, because not only will it change the values, but it will also refresh render. When we're working with that, we never want to directly change this.state ever. We always want to use set state. So, because we're using that function, we need to pass it in values, and we can't pass it in an assignment expression. It doesn't really work. We also want to make sure that whatever we pass in is the constant. We don't want it changing sometime in the future. We want to save something, pass it in. Save something, pass it in. And so that's what we're doing right here. It's a little bit of weirdness of how React does things, but it's not too weird. We just sort of need to keep it in mind. So we always are using set state function. And we see that right here. Items is now equal to the new items, which was the previous items, right here, the previous array, concatenated with something, in this case, the string new item. Again, it's a little bit of weirdness of how React does things, but we're basically saying our new items is equal to our old items plus the concatenation call. So concatenating something, we're adding something to it, we're saving that, then we're passing it to set state. Again, a little bit of weirdness of how React does things, but something we need to keep in mind. We can't directly handle this.state, or we can, but we don't want to ever. We want to always call set state with something because it will change the state and refresh render, which is almost always what we want to happen. So we're calling add item, and we already know due to this little bit right here in line 16, we've already binded it somewhere else. So let's move down to its render function finally. Then shopping list. We see now we have a division, a div around all of this, and within that we have a new div right here called add button. Add button we see is an element object that is imported up here, line 3, which I'll get to momentarily. It has an event handler. Now, as I discussed in the previous video, we can add event handlers as attributes, properties to elements. And when whatever that event happens, it will react in some way. In the previous video, when we were working with clicking stuff, we were keeping track of state information. So whenever the add event handler was called in the previous video, we were changing what was displayed, either a check mark or or an input check mark box. So we were switching between them. In this case, we're saying, okay, whenever this is clicked using this onClick event handler, we're calling this.add item. This is important because what we're doing is passing information that will become a property on another element object. And so that's why this binding up here of the this state becomes incredibly important, because this will actually be called within the scope of another object, but we needed to bind this to shopping list. So finally down here, an unordered list, which we've seen throughout all of these videos in this series, but because we can't run a for loop within JSX because it doesn't work, what we can do though is run a map function and use an arrow function within that to map those out. So it's the same idea we've seen multiple times here. We're just increasing the complexity a little bit, remembering we can't use a for loop. So instead we're using the map on the array to map out each thing. For each thing, we're setting its own item and key as equal to item and indexed, and calling item element object each time. So let me pause for a second and let's go look at add button, and then I'll come back and look at item. So jumping over to add button, we see it's not terribly complex. It's the same idea we actually saw within checkmark when we were talking about that in previous videos. It's a React component. It has a render function. So within its render function, it is returning a button element. And it has its own onClick event handler, which is this.props.onClick. So whatever was passed as its onClick will be the function to be called when this element is clicked. Now let's step back a second into shopping list. We saw down here on line 31, the onClick property was set to the value of this.add item. So over here on add item, this.props.onClick was set to that same value. So what we basically did is we say, okay, when you click on this button associated with add button, it's going to call the add item function, but it's going to call it through the scope of shopping list. So we're saying, okay, when you click this button, do something over here in shopping list. And this helps us to think through state information here. It's a little bit of a complex idea, but through the way we've been handling properties and passing them through to different objects, we can build event handlers, tie them to a certain function or object, and then pass them to another object and say, hey, when this happens, I want you to call this function. This function actually refers to this object with this scope. So it's important thinking through the combinations of this.props, our function calls, and how our objects relate to each other, and how our different interfaces work with each other. So whenever the button element that's part of add button gets clicked, its onClick will actually be the add item function that's part of shopping list. That's what part of all of this sort of rigmarole of binding different things and passing different things is about. We don't want add button doing things. We've lifted the state, again, coming back to this idea I mentioned in React. We're lifting the state, lifting the complexity out of add button and putting it in the shopping list. Because add button is just really showing a button and it's doing some event handling. We don't want it handling anything that has to do with shopping list itself. So we put all shopping list stuff shopping list cares about within that object. And then we're passing all functions to whatever interfaces we need, and those are calling back using bind to that initial object. So add button, we don't really care. It can do whatever it wants. And we just say, hey, whenever you get a click, call this function. This function's part of my stuff. I'll handle it from here. So that's what's going on there. Finally, let's move over to item. Item looks the same, almost the same as it does in the previous video. I snuck in a little bit of event handling in the previous video when we were talking about state information. Notice it looks very similar to as I was talking through shopping list. First thing we're doing is props, incredibly important, passing that into this, then calling super so React component has it. Then we're setting up its state. We care about is done. Is done is set to false. And as I talked through in the previous video, we're doing a little bit of conditional checking to see if is done is true or false. If it's true, we're showing check mark. If it's false, we're showing that input element, and it has its own little event handler this time, and it's changing its set state. Again, using set state every time. Do not directly change that state. Pretty much ever. You can do it, but it's highly not recommended. We're going to use set state because we want to change a state, refresh, render. Change a state, refresh, render. So we're changing a value, and depending on what this is, it's either going to show check mark or it's going to show input box. And it's going to come down here, and this.props.name is passed from shopping list now, where we have a name and it has its own key. So now we're being even more dynamic about it. Instead of multiple function calls, we're calling a map on an array that's calling our multiple elements depending on whatever is in there. It's building all of these dynamically, and we're setting different things and using state information, whatever information that component has, and reacting to interactivity through different event handlers. Item has its own event handler that handles its own state information, and now shopping list has some event handlers that were actually passed off to other things. So let's look at all of this running finally over here on the right hand side. If I click this button, we see a new item. If I click this, we see it now has a checkbox. Not very complicated, we think, until we look through all of this code here. But it builds off the idea of the previous video, right? We're talking about states with an item. Item was keeping track of its own state. I'll come back over here to item as I'm talking about it. And we saw, depending on whatever its state was, it would either show checkmark or it would show input box with its own event handler on click, which changed, calling this.state its state information. We saw that in the previous video as I talked about states. The new interesting wrinkle, though, was in shopping list. As I talk through, add item is being called through the add button. This was passed through its this.props. And it says, okay, this.state.items, which we know right here, concat, add a new thing. And then we're calling this.state, and we're passing in whatever the new total amount of items is. Again, keeping track of how React does things. It prefers us not to use a lot of loop structures and instead rely on the built-in functions in JavaScript. Things like concat, things like map. Because we're not doing a lot of for loops and things like that. We're using the inbuilt functions to more efficiently combine all this information together. So let's review everything we looked at in this video. As we talked about in index.js, we immediately jumped to shopping list. Shopping list was an example of using state information. We set up this.state, and it has initial value of items, which is an empty array. Then I talk through how we can bind this keyword to a certain function, which allows us to then pass off that function to other objects, and it means when it's called in that other object, it will call it with the scope of the initial object in which it's set. And we do that through the bind function. So we're passing off the add item to another thing. We say, hey, whenever that's called, how about you call me instead? I'll handle that. We saw with an add item, we concatenated whatever the new thing was, and then we called set state, remembering we always call set state because not only will it change the state information, it will refresh render. Finally, within render, we saw that we're using add button. We're passing it along this.item, which will be called within the scope of shopping list. And because we can't do loops within JSX, where we're using map to map out whatever the items were within the items array, and each time setting its name and key. With an item, which has its own event handler, it was doing a similar thing, saving props each time, setting up its own state information, keeping track of is done or not, and had its own little event handler, which was changing the set state, using the set state function to change its state. Remembering each time we want to call set state, not only will it change its state, it will refresh render. incredibly important, and we need to keep track of that. Finally, down here, we're showing that light item using either item, which will be checkmark, or will be this input checkbox, and whatever was passed to it as its name, which we know was the string new item from shopping list, which was concatenated each time. So, as we see over here on the right-hand side, I can add a bunch of new items to our to-do list, and I can go through and check them off each time. I don't currently have code to remove them, but we can add them using event handlers on item and an event handler that was part of shopping list that was handed off to add button. Thanks for watching.